The first thing Yara noticed about the occupied city was the silence between the sounds. There was noise enough. The low, resonant thrumming of Veth patrol drones, moving in staggered grid patterns above the rooftops. The occasional crack of a compliance rod, discharging somewhere in the market district. The wet shuffle of 10,000 human feet, moving exactly where the morning broadcast told them to move. Noise everywhere. But underneath it, threaded through every gap between sounds, was a silence that had no natural right to exist in a city of 3 million people. No laughter, no argument. No child calling out for a parent who had wandered too far ahead. Just footsteps, just compliance. Just the specific quiet of a species that had been taught, very thoroughly, not to think too hard about anything at all. Yara pulled her hood lower and kept walking. She had spent 14 months on the outer station, running spectral analysis on Veth neural frequency emitters. And she understood the mechanism better than anyone still alive outside a Veth research facility. The resonance, that was what people called it. The ones who still had enough cognition left to call it anything, operated on a narrow band of electromagnetic frequency that matched the oscillation pattern of the human prefrontal cortex. It didn't destroy thought. That was the elegant cruelty of it. It merely made certain kinds of thought feel wrong, uncomfortable, like pressing a bruise. Political thought, coordinated thought. The particular kind of thought that asks, why are things this way, and what would happen if they were different? The Veth had not conquered humanity with weapons. They had conquered it with a very precise discomfort. She ducked into a narrow alley between a shuttered pharmacy and a crumbling apartment block, checked that no one was watching, and tapped 3 times on a section of wall that looked exactly like every other section of wall. A pause. 2 taps back from the other side, she found the loose brick, pressed it, and a door-shaped section of plaster swung inward on silent hinges. Inside, 5 people looked up at her from a ring of mismatched chairs around a camp table covered in handwritten notes, circuit diagrams, and 3 empty coffee cups. A single battery-powered lamp hung from a hook in the low ceiling, throwing shadows that made everyone's face look slightly more desperate than they probably felt. "You're 2 hours late," said the man at the head of the table, Luis, former structural engineer, currently the closest thing this cell had to a leader, which meant he was the person everyone argued with most often. He had a broad, tired face and the posture of someone who had spent the last 8 months waiting for something to happen. "I took a longer route," Yara said, sitting in the empty chair. "There's a new drone pattern in the western grid. Overlapping coverage. Someone tightened the net." "They do that every 3 weeks," said Danny, not looking up from the transistor board she was soldering. Danny was 24 and had the focused, slightly frightening calm of someone who had decided at some specific moment that she was no longer afraid of dying. "It's a rotation. They'll loosen it again in 5 days. Or they know something," said Marco. He was the oldest of them, 51. A former professor of cognitive linguistics who had been one of the first to understand what the resonance actually was. He sat with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man perpetually on the verge of saying, "I told you so." If they've tightened the western grid, it's because someone talked, or someone was seen, or someone did something careless. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone is thinking the same name and no one wants to say it. "Tio hasn't come back," said the young man by the window. His name was Rafa, and he was the youngest of them at 19, and he was the only one who still looked occasionally surprised by how bad things had gotten. "He was supposed to return last night." "Tio is careful," Luis said. "Tio was careful," Marco said. Another silence. Outside, a drone passed low over the alley, its thrumming frequency dropping in pitch as it moved away. Everyone in the room felt it without acknowledging it. The faint mental itch of the resonance. The particular subtle wrongness that the emitters broadcast at close range. Even here, shielded by a meter of old stone, and the metallic lining Danny had painstakingly attached to the walls over 3 weeks, you could feel the edge of it. Like standing at the boundary of a bad smell. Yara set her bag on the table and unzipped it. Inside, packed in foam insulation and sealed in a glass ampoule the size of her thumb, was a pale golden liquid that caught the lamplight and held it. She set it gently on the table between the coffee cups and the circuit diagrams, and for a moment all 5 of them just looked at it. "That's all of it?" Luis asked. "That's enough." She had done the calculations 17 times on the outer station and twice more since landing. 1 ampoule, vaporized and dispersed through the atmospheric circulation system at the central exchange node, will achieve 94% atmospheric coverage of the city within 6 hours. The remaining 6% will achieve coverage within 10. What exactly does it do, Rafa said. He had asked before, but she understood why he kept asking. Some information needs to be heard more than once, before it settles into belief. The Veth resonance works by broadcasting in a frequency that makes certain neural pathways uncomfortable to activate, Yara said, the same way she had explained it a dozen times in the last 3 months. The calm doesn't counteract the frequency. It restructures the receptor sites in the prefrontal cortex, permanently gently, in a way that the human brain actually already wants to be, so that those pathways become inaccessible as targets. The resonance broadcasts and finds nothing to lock onto. It passes through. She paused. People remember how to think. Permanently, Marco repeated. Permanently. The word sat in the room. No one touched it for a moment. And the Veth, Luis said. Once people can think again. What happens then? 3 million people who have been living under cognitive suppression for 4 years, Marco said slowly. And who suddenly remember what that was like. He uncrossed his arms. His voice was different now. Careful. That is not a small thing to release into a city. It's not a small thing that was done to them, Danny said without looking up from her soldering. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying we need to think about what comes after. History, Louis said. And his voice had an edge to it that Yara had not heard before, has had 4 years to sort this out. I'm no longer willing to wait for history. Marco opened his mouth. No, Louis said. I have heard this argument. I have heard it in this room for 8 months. We wait for the conditions to ripen. We wait for the population to develop natural resistance. We wait for the Veth to overextend. And while we wait, Tio doesn't come back. And 6 months ago, Petra didn't come back. And before that it was Hen and Diego and Cass. We are not a large group to begin with. He looked at the ampoule. We have the means, we have the target. We have someone who understands the chemistry better than anyone on the planet. He looked at Yara. What we don't have is a reason to wait any longer. The silence this time was different. It had weight to it, decision-shaped. Yara looked at the ampoule. She had carried it for 14 months, the last 2 years of her life on the outer station, watching through telescope arrays as the Veth ships settled over city after city, and the lights of coordinated human resistance went out one by one. She had built the compound from first principles, working backward from captured Veth frequency data, synthesizing and testing and refining in a lab the size of a broom closet, while the station's life support ran on recycled air and prayer. She had come back to Earth on a shuttle held together with patch seals and good luck, alone, to find 5 people in a basement who were still arguing about whether to act. She understood Marco's caution. She had run the same calculations. A city of 3 million suddenly recovering their cognitive autonomy was not a predictable system. There would be chaos. There would probably be violence. There were Veth enforcement units stationed at 9 points throughout the city, and those units were armed. And a population that had been docile for 4 years would need time to remember how to be dangerous. But she had also run a different calculation, the one where they waited, the one where they kept sending people out who didn't come back, the one where the Veth eventually, inevitably, found this basement, and the ampoule was destroyed, and the 8 years of work that had gone into it was gone. And humanity continued in its quiet, administered compliance until the Veth decided that administration was no longer worth the expense. She already knew which calculations she trusted. There's one other problem, Danny said. She had put down her soldering iron. She was looking at the circuit board in front of her, with the expression of someone who has just noticed something they should have noticed an hour ago. The atmospheric exchange node. It's in the central utility complex, which is inside the Veth administrative cordon. She looked up. We can't just walk in. I know where the maintenance access tunnels come out, Rafa said. Everyone turned to look at him. He had the slightly defensive expression of someone who had been holding information back and decided this was the moment to release it. Tio showed me, before. There are 2 access points outside the cordon. One under the old market, one in the river embankment. The maintenance passages connect to the node chamber from below. Tio showed you, Marco said. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone should know. Rafa met Marco's eyes steadily. For a 19-year-old, he had very steady eyes. Someone does. Luis looked at Yara. How long to set up dispersal once we're in the node chamber? 20 minutes. Maybe 15 if Danny has finished what I think she's finishing. Danny held up the circuit board. It was a dispersal modulator, a device that would, when connected to the node's atmospheric intake manifold, convert the ampoule's liquid compound into a fine aerosol. and introduce it into the circulation system on a timed delay. Yara's design, Danny's construction, it was, objectively, a beautiful piece of engineering. Done, Danny said. Then we go tonight, Lewis said. Marco stood up. For a moment, Yara thought he was going to leave, and she felt something cold move through her chest. Not about the plan, but about what it would mean if he walked out. He was the best of them at understanding what came after. They needed that. He didn't leave. He walked to the lamp and turned it slightly, so the light fell more evenly on the table, and then he sat back down, and he picked up a pen, and he started drawing a route map from memory. The western grid is tight, he said. We go east first, double back through the river district. Rafa, you'll lead us to the embankment access. Yara carries the ampoule. I carry nothing valuable. If they stop us, I'm a man who got confused about curfew. He looked around the table. We move in 2 hours. Anyone who needs to eat, eat now. They ate. Tinned fish and hard bread, and the last of a jar of pickled vegetables that Danny had been rationing for 3 weeks. They ate without ceremony, sitting around a table covered in the evidence of their conspiracy, 5 people consuming calories, with the efficient practicality of people who have accepted that they may not eat again for quite some time. Rafa at some point started humming, something old, a tune Yara half recognized, something that had been in the air before the resonance, before all of this. No one told him to stop. The tune moved around the room and settled, and for a moment the basement felt less like a place where frightened people were hiding, and more like a place where people had chosen to be. She thought about her mother's apartment in the Eastern District, where she had grown up, the specific smell of the stairwell, the argument her mother used to have every Sunday with the neighbor on the floor below about the precise boundary of their respective balcony spaces, the absolute ordinary humanity of a world that argued about balconies. She wanted that back. Not just for herself, for the 3 million people walking in careful silence through the streets above her head. She picked up the ampoule and put it back in its foam-lined case. And she put the case in her bag, and she checked the clasps 3 times. 2 hours later, they moved. The river district at night was a different city from the administered daylight version. The VETH drone coverage in the narrow lanes near the embankment was thinner. The waterways created acoustic interference that disrupted the drone's own navigation systems. A structural weakness isn't the patrol grid that Marco had identified 8 months ago, and that apparently no VETH systems engineer had thought to correct. This either meant the VETH were less thorough than they appeared, or it was a trap. They proceeded as if it was not a trap and tried not to think too hard about the alternative. Rafa moved well in the dark. Better than any of them, actually. He had the particular liquid confidence of someone who had spent years navigating spaces he wasn't supposed to be in. A skill that predated the occupation and had merely found new applications in its aftermath. He led them along the embankment wall in single file, keeping to the chateau under the overhang, his feet finding the uneven stones without sound. Danny was behind him, then Marco, then Luis, then Yara, last one hand on her bag and one hand occasionally touching the embankment wall for orientation. The access point was a maintenance hatch in the base of the embankment, half concealed by decades of accumulated silt and a rusted grill that looked immovable until Rafa pressed a specific point on the lower left corner, and it swung outward on a pivot balanced so precisely that a child could have opened it. Tio had clearly spent considerable time on that hinge. One by one they dropped into the maintenance tunnel below. The tunnel smelled of old concrete and slow water, and something faintly metallic that Yara couldn't identify and chose not to examine further. It was wide enough to walk upright, lit every 30 meters by a work light that Tio had apparently installed at some point during the 8 months before he stopped coming back. The lights ran on a separate circuit from the city grid, powered by a battery array that Rafa said was in a side chamber about 200 meters along. Tio had thought of everything. They moved throughout the tunnel in a silence that was different from the silence above. This one was chosen. This one had intention in it. The central utility complex occupied a block-sized section of the administrative cordon, originally a water treatment facility from the previous century, repurposed by the VETH into the atmospheric management node for the city's resonance distribution system. The VETH had, with characteristic efficiency, used existing infrastructure. The city's ventilation and atmospheric circulation network, built to manage air quality and temperature, had been retrofitted with resonance emitter arrays that distributed the frequency across the entire population simultaneously. It was elegant. It was the kind of elegant that you could only admire if you worked very hard to separate the mechanism from its purpose. The maintenance tunnel connected to the node chamber from the original service infrastructure through a junction that the Veth's engineering surveys had apparently classified as non-functional. Another oversight. Humanity's salvation, Yara was coming to understand, would be assembled from a long list of alien oversights. The junction door was steel, old, painted gray several decades ago and not again since. Louise tried the handle. Locked. Danny produced a small device from her jacket pocket and pressed it against the lock plate. A pause. A click. The door opened. The node chamber was enormous. A vaulted space 20 meters high, packed with original water treatment infrastructure, and, layered over and through it, the clean geometric installations of Veth technology. Emitter arrays mounted on the original pipe stanchions, frequency modulators integrated into the old circulation pumps. The whole thing humming at a frequency that Yara felt immediately in the back of her teeth, in the fine hairs of her forearms, in some deep structural place below conscious thought. Here at the source, the resonance was not a distant discomfort. It was a presence, a weight. You feel that, Marco said. It was not a question. Yes, Yara said. How are you still thinking? Practice. She was already moving toward the atmospheric intake manifold, a massive horizontal pipe that connected the Veth circulation system to the original building's atmospheric ducts, which connected to the city's ventilation network, which connected to the air that 3 million people breathed. The brain adapts to ambient frequency over time if it's given enough stimulation to compete with. I've been solving complex problems every day for 14 months. The prefrontal cortex strengthens against the suppression the same way a muscle strengthens against resistance. She found the manifold coupling. She opened her bag. She took out the dispersal modulator. Danny, I need you. Danny was already there, tools out, examining the manifold junction with the calm efficiency that was her specific form of courage. Integration point here, Yara said, indicating a coupling flange. The modulator connects at this port and introduces the aerosol into the intake airflow. Once it's in the airstream, dispersal begins. How long? To install 10 minutes if nothing goes wrong, and if something goes wrong. Let's establish a baseline by assuming things go right. Danny nodded and began work. Yara assisted, holding components, reading connection specifications from the handwritten notes she had memorized, and then written down anyway, because memorization under stress was less reliable than people liked to believe. Luis and Rafa watched the chamber entrances. Marco stood near the center of the chamber and turned slowly, examining the Veth equipment with the expression of a linguist encountering a new grammar. Not a soldier assessing a threat, but a scholar trying to understand a system. Even now, under pressure, in the source of the thing that had been suppressing his people's minds for 4 years, he was taking notes in the margins of his understanding. Yara, he said. Yes, when this works, not if she noticed that. When this works and people start to wake up, what will they feel first? She thought about it while helping Danny torque a coupling to specification. Confusion, because they've been told for 4 years that what they were feeling was normal. Then probably anger, when they understand what was done to them. Then, she paused. Then they'll start calling each other, talking, arguing, all the things you do when you can think again. The Veth enforcement units will have a very bad morning. Yes, Marco was quiet for a moment. Good. From somewhere above them in the administrative complex overhead, something changed in the hum of the building. A shift in frequency. Subtle, but Yara had spent 14 months learning to hear exactly this kind of shift. Faster, she said. What? They're running a diagnostic sweep. The manifold will show a pressure anomaly if it's not sealed before the sweep reaches this level. Danny, I know, Danny said. Her hands did not slow, but their precision increased in some ineffable way. The way a musician's playing doesn't get faster, but gets more exact under pressure. She was threading a coupling lock that required 3 simultaneous movements, and she was doing it in the dark with one hand, while the other held a component steady, and she was doing it correctly. The hum above them shifted again, closer. Yara took the ampoule from its foam case. She held it up in the chamber light and looked at it one more time. The pale gold of it, the way it moved slightly when she tilted it. 14 months of synthesis. 2 years before that of theoretical work. The entire reason she had survived when others hadn't, because she had something to do that couldn't be done by anyone else. And that specific weight of purpose had kept her moving when nothing else would have. She thought about her mother's apartment, the argument about the balcony. Ready, Danny said. Yara seated the ampoule in the modulator's input chamber. The fitting was exact. She had designed them together, the ampoule and the modulator, like a lock and the only key that would ever open it. 20-second delay before dispersal begins, she said. Once I arm the sequence, we have 20 seconds to clear the chamber. 20 seconds is enough, Louis said. Yes. She looked around the chamber. The 5 of them. She counted them without meaning to, a habit she had developed, checking that the number hadn't decreased. 5. Still 5. She armed the sequence. Move, Louis said. They moved. The 20 seconds felt like a different unit of time from any 20 seconds Yara had previously experienced. They crossed the chamber floor at a run, through the junction door, into the tunnel. Behind them the manifold gave a sound like a deep intake breath. The modulator, engaging. The compound aerosolizing, entering the intake airstream, being lifted and distributed by 14 stories of atmospheric infrastructure into the ventilation network of the city above. They ran. The tunnel was not designed for running, and the ceiling was occasionally less than Yara's standing height. And Marco stumbled once on the uneven floor and Luis caught him without breaking stride, and they kept going. 5 people in a concrete tunnel under a conquered city, running toward a hatch in a river embankment. Above them, rising through duct and pipe, and the ancient infrastructure of a city built by human hands for human habitation. A pale gold aerosol that smelled of nothing, and looked like nothing moved with the air circulation, passenger on a system that had been carrying human breath for a century and would now carry something more. They emerged from the hatch into the cold air of the river embankment, and they stopped, and they breathed the night air and looked at each other. How long? Rafa said. The atmospheric circulation turns over the full city volume every 4 hours under normal operating conditions, Yara said. The VETH boosted the circulation rate for resonance efficiency, so we're looking at closer to 2.5 hours for full initial coverage. The effect at low concentration will be subtle. People will notice something different in the hour before dawn. And then, Danny said, and then they'll start thinking. Above them, the drone grid moved in its programmed patterns, indifferent and thorough, the VETH enforcement network that had kept 3 million people compliant for 4 years, operating exactly as it had been designed to operate, having no mechanism to detect the thing that was already moving through the air beneath it. They split up as they had planned. Luis and Marco went west, toward the market district, to be in position near one of the larger public squares when morning came. Danny went north, toward the communications infrastructure she had been studying for months, for reasons she had articulated once, and didn't need to articulate again. Rafa would go to ground in the safe house near the old university. Yara went east. She walked through the empty streets of the occupied city in the hour before dawn, and she did not pull her hood down to hide her face. And she moved, at a pace that was not the pace of someone trying not to be seen, but simply the pace of a person who had somewhere to be. Above her, drones moved. Around her, the city slept the administered sleep of a species that had been told to be quiet, and had complied. She turned down the street where she had grown up. The building was the same. Of course it was. The VETH had no interest in demolition, only in administration. The same crumbling render on the 4th floor exterior. The same door that had never quite latched properly since before she was born. She stood on the pavement outside and looked up at the window, on the 3rd floor, dark at this hour, behind which her mother would be sleeping, in whatever way a person sleeps after 4 years, of having the argumentative parts of their mind gently and continuously suppressed. She would wake up in a few hours and feel strange, like surfacing from water she hadn't realized she was under. She would probably be confused, and then frightened, and then, Yara hoped, angry in the way that only people who have been patient for a very long time can be angry, which is to say completely and without apology. Yara sat down on the pavement across from the building, her back against the wall, and she waited. Dawn came the way it always came, indifferent to whether the day it was introducing was ordinary or extraordinary. The light arrived in stages, gray first, then blue, then the particular pale gold of early morning that reminded Yara, and would always now remind her, of the color of a specific ampoule held up in basement lamplight. The city woke up. Not all at once, not dramatically. In ones and twos, the way waking always actually happens when you watch it at the scale of a city rather than a story. A light in a window. Then another. Footsteps on an upper floor, someone moving to a kitchen. The small sounds of morning. And then, from somewhere in the building across the street, a sound that Yara had not heard from a building in 4 years. An argument. Muffled, indistinct. She couldn't make out the words, but unmistakably an argument. 2 voices in genuine disagreement, with the specific rhythm of people who have opinions and are currently inflicting them on each other without institutional sanction. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the administrative complex 3 kilometers away, the VETH diagnostic systems would be running their morning checks. They would notice within the hour that something had changed in the atmospheric composition of the city. They would run secondary diagnostics. They would cross-reference against the maintenance logs for the utility complex. They would find the anomaly in the manifold. By then, it would be too late to matter. Because the things about a population recovering its cognition is that it happens person by person, and then suddenly all at once. And by the time any authority recognizes the scale of what is occurring, the calculation has already shifted in a way that cannot be shifted back. 3 million people who remember what thinking feels like do not become unremembering. That is the property that Yara had worked hardest to build into the compound. Not just the effect, but the permanence. The VETH resonance would continue broadcasting. It would simply find no purchase. The receptor sites had been reshaped. The frequency passed through. She heard another argument start in the building behind her. Down the street, someone was standing on their step looking at the morning, with an expression she could see from 30 meters away. The expression of a person who has just noticed that they have questions and is starting to wonder why they hadn't been asking them. More lights, more sounds. The city was waking up in a way it had not woken up in 4 years, which is to say it was waking up as itself. Her comm device, a salvaged unit she kept on a dead channel, crackled once, a signal on the frequency Luis had assigned, 2 pulses. The code they had agreed on for, "We are in position, we are safe, it is working." She sent back 1 pulse, acknowledged. There was going to be a very difficult few days. She was clear-eyed about that. The VETH enforcement units were not going to stand down because the population had recovered its ability to be discontented. There would be confrontations. The 9 enforcement stations throughout the city were armed, and the units staffed them were not incompetent. Whatever Marco's hopeful characterizations might suggest, there would be people who had been so thoroughly adapted to compliance that the sudden removal of the resonance's pressure would feel disorienting rather than liberating, at least at first. There would be people who were frightened, and people who were reckless, and people who would do things that weren't wise. But 3 million people thinking for themselves were a different problem for the VETH than 3 million people complying. Categorically different. The VETH had built their occupation on the assumption that human behavior was manageable at scale through cognitive management. Remove the management and what was humanity operating as humanity had always operated. Chaotically, creatively, stubbornly, with an extraordinary capacity for collective action when sufficiently motivated, and for improvised problem-solving in adversarial conditions that no species that had never had to fight its way up through its own history would ever fully understand or adequately predict. The VETH were a spacefaring civilization. They had reached Earth with technology centuries beyond anything humans had achieved. They had, within 3 months of arrival, effectively pacified a planet of 8 billion people. They had done all of this without ever quite understanding what they were dealing with. Not an absence of resistance, they had prepared for resistance. But resistance of the kind they knew how to model: organized, rational, hierarchical, predictable. The kind of resistance that a sufficiently advanced suppression system could map and manage. Not this. Not 5 people in a basement who argued for 8 months about whether to act and then acted. Not a xenobiologist who spent 14 months synthesizing a compound in a closet because she was too stubborn to accept that it couldn't be done. Not a 19-year-old who memorized tunnel access points because a man who trusted him had said someone should know. Not an engineer who soldered circuit boards by lamplight with the focused serenity of someone who had made their peace with outcomes. Not humans, specifically. Humans who had been given 4 years to remember how much they did not like being told to be quiet. The argument from the building across the street had gotten louder. Yara could make out words now. Something about a ration allocation. Something about whose turn it was to collect from the distribution point. Something that was entirely mundane and entirely magnificent in its ordinariness. She stood up. She shouldered her empty bag. She crossed the street and pressed the buzzer for the 3rd floor. A long pause. Then a voice through the speaker. A voice she had not heard in 14-month muss, roughened by 4 years of administered quiet, surprised by the buzzer in the way of someone who had not been surprised by anything in a long time. "Who's there?" "It's me," Yara said. "I came back." Another pause, the kind of pause that contains a recalibration. "You should come up," her mother said. I'll put water on. I want to tell you what I think about the neighbor on the floor below." Yara smiled for the first time in what felt like a very long time and went inside. Above the city, the drone grid continued its patterns, programmed and diligent and entirely unaware that the thing it had been built to enforce was already gone. In the utility complex, an alarm was beginning to compile in a diagnostic system that would reach its alert threshold within the hour. In nine enforcement stations, VETH units were completing their morning protocols, unaware that the population they administered had, in the space of a single night, quietly stopped being administrable. In apartments and streets and markets and stairwells, 3 million people were waking up and noticing that they had things to say. Some of them were confused. Some were frightened. Some were angry in the specific profound way of a species that had been patient for 4 years and was done being patient. Many of them were, in this first hour, simply talking, to neighbors, to family, to strangers, discovering that the words came more easily than they had in a long time, and that the particular pressure at the back of their minds, the one they had never quite been able to identify, was gone. It would take weeks to fully organize. Months probably, to see the VETH enforcement apparatus genuinely break down under the pressure of a population it could no longer manage. There would be setbacks. There would be days that were very hard. But the compound was permanent. That was the thing Yara had been most careful about, most obsessive about, across 2 years of theoretical work and 14 months of synthesis. Whatever happened next, whatever the VETH threw at the city, they could not put the cognition back in the bottle. They could not resuppress what had been unsuppressed. The receptor sites were changed. The frequency had no purchase. 3 million minds that the VETH had borrowed, one by one, over 4 years of careful administration, had been returned to their owners in a single night. What their owners chose to do with them was now, entirely and irrevocably, up to them. On the 3rd floor of a building in the Eastern District, in an apartment that smelled of tea and old books, and the specific accumulated scent of a life lived honestly in a small space, a woman who had spent 4 years not arguing with her neighbor was discovering that she had, in fact, quite a lot to say. Her daughter sat across the kitchen table and listened, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a problem that has been solved. Not with power, but with chemistry and stubbornness, and an absolute refusal to believe that the answer didn't exist, simply because finding it was hard. Outside, the city argued. The city laughed. The city raised its voice and lowered it and raised it again. The city was being a city. And somewhere in the administrative complex 3 kilometers away, a VETH diagnostic alarm reached its threshold and triggered. And the officers who received it looked at the readout, and then looked at each other, and then looked out the window at the streets below where the patterns of human movement had become, overnight, distinctly and significantly less predictable. They had a word in their language for the feeling they were experiencing in that moment. It translated approximately as the discovery that the thing you believed was managed was never managed at all. They did not have a word for what humans called stubbornness. They had studied humanity for years and never found it necessary to coin one, because they had not understood it as a distinct phenomenon. They had categorized it under general irrationality, the failure of a species to accept optimal outcomes when presented with them. They were beginning to revise that categorization. In the Eastern District, the water came to a boil.